shocked Alexander and his staff, who had believed these troops to be invincible. The emperor's narrow escape from capture at Austerlitz, achieved only through the sacrifice of his personal escort and the speed of his horse, provided a traumatic introduction to the realities of modern warfare. Alexander's retreat from the battlefield, conducted through the frozen marshes while French cavalry pursued the fleeing Allied forces, demonstrated the complete collapse of Russian military power and the failure of traditional tactics against Napoleon's innovations. The battle's aftermath left over 15,000 Russian casualties on the field, including many of the empire's most experienced officers and elite soldiers. The Treaty of Petersburg, signed in the aftermath of Austerlitz, eliminated Austria as an effective military power and left Russia diplomatically isolated in its struggle against French expansion. Alexander's return to St. Petersburg required a complete reassessment of Russian strategic capabilities and foreign policy objectives. The emperor's initial confidence in Russian military superiority had been shattered, forcing him to recognize that defeating Napoleon would require fundamental changes in military organization, diplomatic strategy, and domestic policy. The Peace of Tilsit in 1807 represented Alexander's most controversial diplomatic decision, creating an alliance with Napoleon that shocked European courts and divided Russian society. The famous meeting between the two emperors on a raft in the Niemen River, with both rulers displaying elaborate courtesy while negotiating the partition of Europe, demonstrated the theatrical nature of early 19th century diplomacy. Alexander's agreement to join the continental system against Britain required Russia to sacrifice its most important trading relationships while supporting French policies that threatened Russian interests in Poland and the Ottoman Empire. The alliance with France provided Russia with a temporary respite from military pressure while allowing Alexander to pursue territorial expansion in Finland and the Balkans. The Finnish War of 1808 to 1809 demonstrated Russian military capabilities against a weaker opponent while providing valuable experience in winter warfare and amphibious operations. The conquest of Finland, achieved through a combination of conventional military operations and diplomatic negotiations, added strategically important territory to the empire, while demonstrating Russia's ability to conduct successful military campaigns despite the setbacks of the Napoleonic Wars. The deterioration of Franco-Russian relations after 1810 reflected fundamental conflicts of interest that made the Tilsit alliance ultimately unsustainable. Napoleon's creation of the Duchy of Warsaw threatened Russian influence in Poland, while his marriage to Marie-Louise of Austria suggested a shift toward alliance with traditional Russian enemies. Alexander's gradual withdrawal from the continental system, motivated by economic necessity and domestic pressure, provided Napoleon with a pretext for military action, while demonstrating Russian determination to maintain independence despite French pressure. The Grande Armée's invasion of Russia in June 1812 represented the largest military operation in European history to that point, with over 600,000 troops from across Napoleon's empire crossing the Niemen River in a campaign designed to force Russian submission through rapid victory. The invasion force included not only French troops, but also Poles, Germans, Italians, and other nationalities who had been incorporated into Napoleon's continental system. The army's massive supply trains, stretching for hundreds of miles, carried provisions for what Napoleon expected to be a brief campaign, culminating in a decisive battle near the Russian frontier. Alexander's decision to avoid immediate battle while withdrawing deeper into Russian territory reflected both strategic calculation and practical necessity. The emperor understood that Russian forces, numbering approximately 200,000 troops divided into two separate armies, could not match the Grande Armée in open battle. The strategy of trading space for time, while allowing Russian forces to concentrate and receive reinforcements, offered the best hope of ultimate victory despite the political costs of abandoning Russian territory to foreign occupation. The appointment of Mikhail Kutuzov as commander-in-chief represented Alexander's recognition that defeating Napoleon required military leadership with both tactical competence and popular credibility. Kutuzov's advanced age, physical disabilities, and reputation for cunning rather than heroism made him an unlikely choice for supreme command. But his experience in previous wars against European powers and his understanding of Russian military culture proved decisive. The general's ability to maintain army morale while conducting a strategic retreat demonstrated the importance of leadership that soldiers could trust and understand. The Battle of Borodino, on September 7, 1812, marked the climactic confrontation between Russian and French forces in an engagement that would determine the campaign's outcome. The battle began at dawn with French artillery bombardment of Russian positions, followed by infantry assaults on the fortified villages of Borodino and Semyonovskaya. Russian defensive preparations, including elaborate earthworks and artillery positions, reflected Kutuzov's understanding that Russian forces must maximize their defensive advantages while minimizing French tactical superiority. The fighting at Borodino demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of early 19th century artillery, with both armies employing hundreds of cannons that created unprecedented destruction on the battlefield. Russian artillery, served by experienced gunners and positioned according to careful calculation, delivered concentrated fire that shattered French assault columns and cavalry charges. The famous battery at the centre of Russian positions, commanded by General Raevski, became the focus of repeated French attacks that resulted in enormous casualties for both sides. Napoleon's failure to commit his Imperial Guard at the crucial moment of the battle reflected his recognition that victory at Borodino would not end the campaign if it came at the cost of his most reliable troops. The Emperor's decision to preserve his elite units while accepting tactical stalemate demonstrated the strategic thinking that had made him master of Europe, but it also allowed Russian forces to maintain their cohesion and fighting capability. The battle's aftermath left both armies severely weakened, with combined casualties exceeding 70,000 men, but Russian forces retained their organizational structure and command hierarchy. The French occupation of Moscow marked the apparent culmination of Napoleon's campaign, but the burning of the ancient capital transformed apparent victory into strategic disaster. The fires that consumed much of the city, whether started by Russian patriots or French soldiers, eliminated the supplies and shelter that the Grande Armée needed for winter operations. Napoleon's expectation that occupying Moscow would force Russian surrender proved completely wrong, as Alexander refused all negotiations while Russian forces continued to operate around the occupied city. The French retreat from Moscow beginning in October 1812 became one of the most devastating military disasters in European history, with Napoleon's army disintegrating under the combined pressure of Russian attacks, winter weather, and logistical collapse. The retreat route, littered with abandoned equipment, frozen corpses, and the debris of military defeat, demonstrated the complete failure of Napoleon's strategic planning and the effectiveness of Russian resistance. Cossack raids on French supply lines, combined with attacks by regular Russian forces, transformed the retreat into a rout that destroyed Napoleon's military reputation and political authority. The liberation of Europe from French domination required extensive military campaigns that tested Russian resources and diplomatic skills, while establishing the empire's position as a dominant European power. Alexander's decision to pursue Napoleon beyond Russian borders, despite the enormous costs and risks involved, reflected his understanding that lasting peace required the complete defeat of French military power. The campaigns of 1813 and 1814 demonstrated Russian military capabilities while creating new international relationships that would influence European politics for decades. The Battle of Leipzig in October 1813 marked the decisive defeat of Napoleon's reconstructed army and the liberation of Germany from French control. Russian forces, fighting alongside Prussian, Austrian and Swedish allies, demonstrated the effectiveness of coalition warfare while showcasing the military reforms that had been implemented since the disasters of 1805. The engagement, involving over 500,000 troops and lasting 3 days, represented the largest battle in European history before the 20th century and established the military reputation of Russian generals like Barclay de Tolly and Wittgenstein. The occupation of Paris in March 1814 marked the culmination of the coalition's victory and Alexander's emergence as the dominant figure in European politics. The emperor's entry into the French capital, accompanied by allied sovereigns and military commanders, demonstrated the complete reversal of the strategic situation that had existed just 2 years earlier. Alexander's magnanimous treatment of the French people and his insistence on Napoleon's abdication rather than execution reflected both political calculation and genuine humanitarian concern. The Congress of Vienna provided Alexander with the opportunity to reshape European political arrangements according to Russian interests while establishing principles of international law that would govern European relations for the next century. The emperor's role as mediator between competing national interests, combined with his control of the largest military force in Europe, gave him unprecedented influence over territorial arrangements and constitutional questions. The creation of the Kingdom of Poland under Russian sovereignty represented a major expansion of Russian power, while satisfying Polish aspirations for autonomy and self-government. Alexander's religious conversion during the later stages of the Napoleonic Wars profoundly influenced his approach to domestic and foreign policy, creating a mystical dimension to Russian imperial authority that would persist throughout the 19th century. The emperor's correspondence with various religious figures, including the German mystic Baroness Krudner, reflected his belief that divine providence had chosen him to restore Christian principles to European politics. This religious awakening influenced his support for the Holy Alliance and his increasing conservatism in domestic affairs. The Holy Alliance, signed by Russia, Austria and Prussia in September 1815, represented Alexander's attempt to establish international relations based on Christian principles rather than purely secular considerations. The treaty's vague language about ruling according to the sublime truths which the holy religion of our Saviour teaches reflected the emperor's mystical beliefs while providing a framework for conservative cooperation against liberal and revolutionary movements. The alliance's practical effects proved limited, but its symbolic importance in legitimizing conservative intervention in domestic affairs of other states would influence European politics throughout the 19th century. Alexander's domestic policies during the post-war period reflected the tension between his earlier liberal aspirations and his growing conservatism in the face of revolutionary threats. The emperor's support for constitutional government in Poland and Finland contrasted sharply with his resistance to similar reforms in Russia proper, creating contradictions that would influence political development throughout the empire. The establishment of military colonies under General Alexei Arachiv represented an attempt to combine military efficiency with agricultural productivity, but the system's harsh discipline and regimentation created widespread resentment among both soldiers and peasants. The Decembrist movement emerged from the contradiction between Alexander's liberal rhetoric and his conservative policies, as young officers who had served in the liberation of Europe returned to Russia with expectations of political reform that were not fulfilled. The secret societies that developed among Guards officers and aristocratic intellectuals reflected exposure to European political ideas and frustration with Russian autocratic traditions. The Southern Society, led by Colonel Pavel Pestel, developed comprehensive plans for republican government and social reform that challenged the fundamental principles of imperial rule. Alexander's sudden death in Taganrog on December 1, 1825, created a succession crisis that provided the Decembrists with their opportunity to attempt revolutionary change. The confusion over whether Constantine or Nicholas would inherit the throne, combined with the interregnum period while the question was resolved, created a political vacuum that the conspirators hoped to exploit. The emperor's death far from the capital, and the delay in communicating the succession decision, provided the rebels with several weeks to organize their plans and coordinate their activities. The Decembrist revolt on December 26, 1825, represented the first organized attempt by the Russian nobility to limit autocratic power and establish constitutional government. The rebels' decision to refuse the oath of allegiance to Nicholas I, while demanding constitutional monarchy, reflected their commitment to political principles that had been developing since the Napoleonic Wars. The revolt's failure, despite the participation of elite military units and prominent aristocratic families, demonstrated both the strength of autocratic institutions and the limitations of revolutionary organization in early 19th century Russia. The gunshots that echoed across Senate Square on December 26, 1825, marked more than just the suppression of a military revolt. They announced the beginning of a new era in Russian imperial governance that would be defined by systematic control, ideological rigidity, and the creation of the most comprehensive surveillance apparatus Europe had yet witnessed. Nicholas I, standing amid the smoke and carnage of his first day as emperor, understood that the Decembrist uprising represented not merely a political challenge, but a fundamental threat to the autocratic principle that had sustained Russian power for centuries. The sight of his own Guards officers lying dead in the snow, their blood staining the cobblestones of the capital, convinced the new emperor that Russia's survival depended on the complete elimination of liberal ideas and the establishment of absolute control over every aspect of Russian society. The investigation that followed the revolt's suppression revealed the extent to which European political ideas had penetrated Russian educated society, shocking Nicholas and his advisors with evidence of secret societies, constitutional plans, and republican sympathies among the empire's most privileged classes. The interrogations, conducted personally by the emperor in the Peter and Paul fortress, exposed networks of conspiracy that extended throughout the military, bureaucracy, and aristocracy. Nicholas spent hours questioning individual conspirators, taking detailed notes on their motivations, connections, and political beliefs, while developing a comprehensive understanding of the ideological threats facing his regime. The emperor's physical presence during these interrogations reflected his hands-on approach to governance and his determination to understand personally the forces that threatened imperial authority. Standing over 6 feet tall with penetrating blue eyes and a military bearing that commanded immediate attention, Nicholas possessed the imposing presence necessary to intimidate prisoners, while extracting crucial information about revolutionary networks. His methodical approach to questioning, combined with promises of mercy for those who cooperated fully, yielded detailed confessions that provided the foundation for the surveillance system he would subsequently establish. The execution of 5 Decembrist leaders on July 25, 1826, demonstrated Nicholas's commitment to using exemplary punishment as a deterrent to future revolutionary activity. The hanging of Pavel Pestel, Kondraty Ryleyev, Sergei Muravyev-Apostol, Mikhail Bestujev-Ryumin, and Pyotr Kakhovsky in the courtyard of the Peter and Paul fortress marked the first political executions in Russia since the reign of Elizabeth, symbolizing the new emperor's willingness to use extreme measures to maintain order. The botched nature of the executions, with several ropes breaking and requiring the condemned men to be hanged twice, created an atmosphere of horror that spread throughout Russian society and demonstrated the regime's determination to crush opposition regardless of the methods required. The establishment of the Third Section in 1826 represented Nicholas's most significant institutional innovation, creating a secret police organization that would monitor, investigate, and suppress any activities deemed threatening to imperial authority. General Alexander Benkendorf, appointed as the Third Section's first chief, brought to the position extensive experience in military intelligence and a sophisticated understanding of European revolutionary movements. His elegant appearance, refined manners, and multilingual capabilities masked a ruthless efficiency in organizing surveillance networks that would penetrate every level of Russian society. The Third Section's organizational structure reflected the systematic approach that characterized Nicholas's entire reign, with specialized departments responsible for monitoring different segments of society and types of potential threats. The political police section focused on tracking revolutionary activities, maintaining files on suspected dissidents, and infiltrating secret societies before they could organize effective opposition. The censorship department reviewed all published materials, from books and newspapers to private correspondence, ensuring that dangerous ideas could not spread through Russian society. The religious affairs section monitored old believers, sectarians, and other religious minorities whose alternative loyalties might threaten state authority. The network of informants that the Third Section developed throughout the empire created an atmosphere of suspicion and fear that fundamentally altered social relationships in Russian society. University professors found their lectures monitored by student informants, while aristocratic salons operated under the constant threat of surveillance by servants or guests who reported conversations to the authorities. The system's effectiveness depended not only on paid agents, but also on voluntary informants who believed they were serving the state by reporting suspicious activities or conversations. This voluntary cooperation reflected the success of Nicholas's ideological campaign to identify loyalty to the emperor with patriotic duty and Orthodox faith. The Third Section's headquarters on Fontanka Street in St. Petersburg became a symbol of the new order's omnipresence, with its yellow building serving as a constant reminder of the state's surveillance capabilities. The organization's distinctive blue uniforms, worn by agents conducting investigations and arrests, created a visible presence throughout Russian cities that reinforced the message that no activity escaped official attention. The psychological impact of this visibility often proved more effective than actual surveillance, as citizens modified their behavior based on the assumption that they were being watched even when no agents were present. The development of the official nationality doctrine under Education Minister Sergei Uvarov provided the ideological framework that justified and legitimized Nicholas's authoritarian policies. The formula of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality offered a comprehensive worldview that presented Russian imperial institutions as the natural and divinely ordained expression of Russian national character. This doctrine rejected European liberal ideas as foreign impositions that threatened Russia's unique historical development and spiritual mission, creating an intellectual foundation for resistance to political reform and cultural westernization. The Orthodox component of official nationality emphasized the Russian Orthodox Church's role as the guardian of national identity and the source of moral authority that legitimized imperial rule. Nicholas's policies strengthened church influence over education, censorship, and social policy while presenting religious orthodoxy as inseparable from political loyalty. The emperor's personal piety, demonstrated through regular church attendance and support for monastic institutions, provided a model for the integration of religious faith with imperial service that was expected of all Russian subjects. The autocracy principle within official nationality doctrine presented unlimited imperial power as the only form of government suited to Russian conditions and national character. Uvarov's theoretical writings argued that constitutional limitations on royal authority, while perhaps appropriate for other European nations, would destroy the unity and strength that had enabled Russia to survive centuries of foreign invasion and internal strife. This argument provided intellectual justification for rejecting political reforms while presenting autocratic rule as a patriotic necessity rather than arbitrary tyranny. The nationality component of the doctrine emphasized the unique character of Russian civilization and its superiority to European alternatives, creating a framework for cultural policy that promoted Russian language, customs, and institutions while suppressing minority cultures within the empire. This aspect of official nationality supported policies that restricted the use of Polish, Lithuanian, and other non-Russian languages in education and administration, while promoting Russian settlement in border regions. The doctrine's emphasis on Russian cultural superiority provided justification for imperial expansion and colonial policies that brought non-Russian peoples under direct imperial control. The implementation of official nationality doctrine through the educational system created a generation of Russian intellectuals and administrators who had been trained to view autocratic rule and Orthodox faith as natural and necessary components of Russian identity. University curricula were revised to emphasize Russian history, literature, and philosophy, while reducing exposure to European political and social theories. The appointment of government officials to university positions ensured that academic instruction supported rather than challenged imperial policies, creating an intellectual environment that reinforced rather than questioned existing political arrangements. The Polish uprising of 1830 provided Nicholas with his first major test as emperor and an opportunity to demonstrate his commitment to suppressing revolutionary movements throughout Europe. The revolt began in Warsaw on November 29, 1830, when Polish military cadets attacked the residence of Grand Duke Constantine, the emperor's brother who served as Viceroy of Poland. The uprising quickly spread throughout the Polish territories, with revolutionary committees proclaiming independence and organizing military resistance to Russian rule. The rebels' initial success in capturing Warsaw and defeating Russian forces at Stoczek created expectations of European support that would prove tragically misplaced. The Polish revolutionaries' decision to dethrone Nicholas as King of Poland and establish a provisional government represented a direct challenge to imperial authority that could not be ignored without encouraging similar revolts throughout the empire. The emperor's response demonstrated his understanding that successful suppression of the Polish revolt was essential for maintaining Russian credibility as a European power and preventing the spread of revolutionary ideas to other imperial territories. The mobilization of over 100,000 Russian troops for the Polish campaign represented one of the largest military operations since the Napoleonic Wars, requiring extensive logistical planning and coordination that tested the reformed Russian military system. Field Marshal Ivan Paskewicz's campaign against the Polish rebels demonstrated the effectiveness of Russian military reforms, while revealing the limitations of revolutionary enthusiasm against professional military organization. The Siege of Warsaw, lasting from September 6th to September 8th, 1831, showcased Russian artillery, capabilities and engineering skills that had been developed through decades of European warfare. The bombardment of the Polish capital, conducted with mathematical precision and devastating effect, forced the surrender of rebel forces while demonstrating Russian determination to use whatever force was necessary to maintain imperial control. The aftermath of the Polish revolt's suppression involved systematic policies designed to eliminate Polish autonomy and integrate the former kingdom fully into the Russian imperial system. The constitution that Alexander II had granted to Poland was revoked, while Polish administrative institutions were replaced by Russian provincial governments that operated according to imperial rather than local laws. The University of Warsaw was closed, Polish schools were placed under Russian supervision, and the use of Polish language in official proceedings was prohibited. These measures reflected Nicholas's belief that successful imperial control required not only military victory, but also the elimination of alternative sources of authority and identity. The confiscation of Polish estates and their redistribution to Russian nobles represented both punishment for rebellion and a systematic attempt to alter the social structure of former Polish territories. Thousands of Polish landowners lost their properties, which were granted to Russian military officers and civilian officials who had served loyally during the suppression of the revolt. This policy created a new Russian landowning class in Poland, while eliminating the economic foundation of Polish aristocratic independence. The settlement of Russian administrators and their families in Polish cities further reinforced imperial control, while creating communities that maintained loyalty to St. Petersburg rather than local interests. The deportation of Polish revolutionaries to Siberia established precedents for the treatment of political prisoners that would characterize Russian imperial policy for the remainder of the 19th century. The forced march of thousands of Polish soldiers and civilians to remote settlements in Siberia created a system of political exile that served both punitive and preventive purposes. The harsh conditions of Siberian exile, combined with the impossibility of return without imperial permission, provided a deterrent to future revolutionary activity, while removing dangerous individuals from areas where they might organize resistance. The Hungarian Revolution of 1848 provided Nicholas with another opportunity to demonstrate Russian commitment to suppressing European revolutionary movements while establishing the empire's role as the gendarme of Europe. The uprising against Austrian rule in Hungary, led by Lajos Kossuth and other liberal nationalists, threatened to destroy the Habsburg Empire and create a precedent for successful revolutionary activity that might inspire similar movements within Russian territories. The emperor's decision to intervene militarily in Hungary reflected both his ideological opposition to revolutionary principles and his practical concern about the stability of the European conservative order. The Russian intervention in Hungary required careful diplomatic preparation to avoid creating a broader European conflict while ensuring Austrian cooperation in the suppression of revolutionary forces. Nicholas's negotiations with Emperor Franz Joseph demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of European power relationships and his ability to coordinate military action with diplomatic objectives. The agreement to provide Russian military assistance in exchange for Austrian support for Russian policies in other areas created a framework for conservative cooperation that would influence European politics throughout the 1850s. General Ivan Pascovich's Hungarian campaign demonstrated Russian military capabilities while revealing the challenges of conducting operations in unfamiliar terrain against guerrilla forces that enjoyed popular support. The Russian army's advance through the Carpathian Mountains required extensive logistical preparation and coordination with Austrian forces that often proved unreliable or incompetent. The campaign's success depended on Russian ability to adapt traditional military methods to the specific conditions of Hungarian warfare, while maintaining the discipline and organisation that had proven effective in previous conflicts. The Battle of Temesvar on August 9, 1849, marked the decisive defeat of Hungarian revolutionary forces and the restoration of Austrian control over the rebellious province. Russian artillery, positioned on commanding heights overlooking the battlefield, delivered concentrated fire that shattered Hungarian defensive positions, while Russian infantry advanced with bayonets fixed to complete the destruction of enemy forces. The engagement demonstrated the effectiveness of Russian military coordination and the superiority of professional troops over revolutionary militias, regardless of the latter's enthusiasm and local knowledge. The surrender of Hungarian revolutionary forces at Vilagos on August 13, 1849, to Russian rather than Austrian commanders reflected the rebels' recognition that Russian military professionalism offered better prospects for honourable treatment than Austrian desire for revenge. General Artur Gorge's decision to surrender his army to General Paskevich rather than Austrian forces demonstrated the respect that Russian military competence had earned even among enemies. The subsequent execution of Hungarian revolutionary leaders by Austrian authorities, despite Russian recommendations for clemency, created tensions between the two conservative powers while establishing Russia's reputation for military effectiveness, combined with political moderation. The suppression of the Hungarian Revolution enhanced Nicholas's reputation as the defender of conservative principles throughout Europe, while demonstrating Russian military capabilities to potential enemies and allies. The emperor's willingness to commit substantial military resources to support Austrian interests reflected his understanding that revolutionary success in any European country threatened the stability of the entire conservative order. The intervention's success provided Russia with enhanced diplomatic influence, while establishing precedents for conservative intervention in domestic affairs of other European states. The Crimean War began in 1853 as a conflict over Russian claims to protect Orthodox Christians within the Ottoman Empire, but it quickly escalated into a general European war that would expose fundamental weaknesses in Russian military organization and imperial administration. The dispute over the holy places in Jerusalem, involving competing Russian and French claims to protect Christian pilgrims, provided the immediate pretext for conflict, but the underlying issues involved Russian expansion in the Black Sea region and European fears of Russian dominance over the declining Ottoman Empire. Nicholas's decision to occupy the Danubian principalities in July 1853 demonstrated his confidence in Russian military superiority and his belief that European powers would not risk war to support Ottoman interests. The destruction of the Ottoman fleet at Sinope on November 30, 1853, by Admiral Pavel Nakimov's squadron represented the last great victory of the sailing navy era, while inadvertently precipitating European intervention in the conflict. The Russian naval attack, conducted with devastating effectiveness against Ottoman vessels anchored in the harbour, demonstrated Russian naval capabilities while creating the massacre of Sinope that European public opinion used to justify military intervention. The battle's outcome eliminated Ottoman naval power in the Black Sea, while providing European powers with the pretext they needed to declare war on Russia. The entry of Britain and France into the war in March 1854 transformed a regional conflict into a general European war that would test Russian military capabilities against the most advanced European powers. The Allied decision to attack Russia in the Crimean Peninsula reflected strategic calculations about Russian vulnerabilities while avoiding direct assault on Russian heartland territories that might provoke desperate resistance. The choice of Sevastopol as the primary target demonstrated European understanding of the fortress's strategic importance, while underestimating the difficulties of conducting siege operations against a well-fortified position defended by experienced troops. The Allied landing at Eupatoria in September 1854 marked the beginning of siege operations that would expose fundamental weaknesses in Russian military organization and logistical capabilities. The British and French forces, totaling approximately 60,000 troops, brought with them advanced weapons, professional medical services, and systematic supply arrangements that contrasted sharply with Russian military organization. The Allies' use of rifled muskets, explosive shells, and organized medical care provided significant advantages over Russian forces that still relied largely on traditional weapons and methods. The Battle of the Alma on September 20, 1854, demonstrated Russian tactical limitations, while revealing the effectiveness of European military reforms that had been implemented since the Napoleonic Wars. Russian forces, positioned on commanding heights overlooking the river, initially appeared to possess insurmountable advantages that should have enabled them to defeat the Allied assault. However, the superior range and accuracy of British and French rifles, combined with effective artillery support and disciplined infantry tactics, overcame Russian defensive positions through systematic application of firepower and coordinated movement. The siege of Sevastopol, lasting from October 1854 to September 1855, became the focal point of the Crimean War, and exposed the technological and organizational gap that had developed between Russia and Western Europe. The fortress, constructed according to 18th century principles and defended by obsolete artillery, proved vulnerable to modern siege techniques that employed rifled cannons, explosive shells, and systematic engineering approaches. The defenders' heroic resistance, led by Admiral Nakhimov and General Eduard Totleben, demonstrated Russian military courage while highlighting the inadequacy of Russian military technology and organization. The death of Nicholas I on March 2, 1855, during the siege of Sevastopol, marked the end of an era in Russian history and the beginning of recognition that fundamental reforms were necessary for imperial survival. The emperor's final months, spent in growing awareness of Russian military inadequacies and diplomatic isolation, reflected his understanding that the system he had created was insufficient for the challenges of modern warfare and international competition. His deathbed advice to his son Alexander to make peace and implement necessary reforms demonstrated his recognition that Russian autocracy required adaptation to survive in the changing European environment. The fall of Sevastopol on September 11, 1855, after a siege lasting nearly a year, marked the decisive defeat of Russian forces and the exposure of imperial military weaknesses that had been concealed by previous victories against less advanced opponents. The fortress's capture required the coordinated efforts of British, French, and Sardinian forces employing the latest military technology and techniques, but Russian resistance had been so determined that the Allies suffered enormous casualties while achieving their objectives. The siege's outcome demonstrated that Russian military courage and traditional tactics were insufficient against European powers that possessed superior technology and organization. The Treaty of Paris, signed on March 30, 1856, formally ended the Crimean War, while imposing terms that revealed the extent of Russian diplomatic and military defeat. The agreement prohibited Russian naval forces in the Black Sea, neutralized the strategic waterway that had been crucial for Russian expansion, and required the return of territory that had been conquered during previous conflicts with the Ottoman Empire. These terms represented not only military defeat, but also the collapse of the diplomatic system that Nicholas had constructed to maintain Russian influence in European affairs. The humiliation of the Crimean War's conclusion cast a stark shadow over the Russian Empire as Alexander II ascended to the throne in March 1855, inheriting not merely a crown but a nation whose fundamental weaknesses had been exposed before all of Europe. The new emperor, at 37 years of age, possessed a markedly different temperament from his rigid father Nicholas I. Where Nicholas had been tall, imposing and militaristic in bearing, Alexander presented a more approachable figure with his moderate height, thoughtful expression, and tendency toward introspection that reflected his awareness of the monumental challenges facing the empire. His brown hair, already showing traces of premature grey from the stress of witnessing his father's final, desperate attempts to salvage the Crimean campaign, framed a face that bore the weight of understanding that Russia's survival as a great power required fundamental transformation. The emperor's first months in power were consumed with the urgent necessity of ending the disastrous war that had drained Russian resources and exposed the empire's technological and organizational inadequacies. The negotiations leading to the Treaty of Paris revealed the extent to which Russia had become isolated diplomatically, with former allies Austria and Prussia maintaining strict neutrality, while Britain and France dictated terms that would constrain Russian power for decades. Alexander's decision to accept these humiliating conditions, including the neutralization of the Black Sea and the demolition of Russian naval facilities at Sevastopol, reflected his pragmatic recognition that continued resistance would only deepen Russian weakness and delay the reforms necessary for national recovery. The emperor's commitment to comprehensive reform emerged from his understanding that Russia's defeat had resulted not from temporary military setbacks, but from systemic problems that permeated every aspect of imperial administration and society. The war had revealed that Russian soldiers, despite their traditional courage and endurance, could not compete effectively against European forces equipped with rifled muskets, explosive shells, and organized medical services. Russian logistics had proven inadequate for sustaining military operations even within the empire's own territory, while the administrative system had failed to mobilize resources effectively or coordinate military and civilian efforts. These failures convinced Alexander that piecemeal adjustments would be insufficient and that only fundamental restructuring could restore Russian power and prestige. The abolition of serfdom emerged as the most urgent and complex of Alexander's reform initiatives, driven by both moral considerations and practical recognition that the institution had become an obstacle to economic development and military effectiveness. The emperor's personal revulsion at the brutalities of serf ownership, witnessed during his travels as heir to the throne, combined with his understanding that free labour was essential for industrial development and military modernisation. The Crimean War had demonstrated that serfs made unreliable soldiers who fought without enthusiasm for a system that denied them basic human rights, while the institution's economic inefficiencies had prevented the accumulation of capital necessary for technological advancement. The process of emancipation required years of careful preparation and negotiation with noble landowners who viewed the abolition of serfdom as a direct attack on their economic interests and social status. Alexander's approach to this challenge revealed his political sophistication and his understanding that successful reform required the cooperation, or at least acquiescence, of the very groups whose privileges were being curtailed. The emperor established committees of nobles and government officials to develop emancipation plans, ensuring that aristocratic representatives participated in designing the system that would replace serfdom while maintaining their commitment to imperial authority. The Emancipation Manifesto of February 19, 1861, represented one of the most significant social transformations in European history, affecting approximately 23 million serfs who comprised nearly half of the Russian population. The document's language reflected the careful balance Alexander had sought between moral principle and practical necessity, proclaiming the liberation of the serfs while establishing complex arrangements for land redistribution and compensation that would satisfy competing interests. The manifesto's religious imagery, invoking divine blessing for the emperor's benevolent decision, provided ideological justification for the reform while emphasizing the autocratic nature of the decision that no popular pressure or constitutional requirement had compelled. The implementation of emancipation through the redemption payment system created a complex web of financial obligations that would bind former serfs to their villages for decades while providing compensation to their former owners. Under this arrangement, the government purchased land from noble owners at prices that often exceeded market value, then required former serfs to repay these costs through annual redemption payments spread over 49 years. The system's complexity reflected the competing demands of different social groups, with nobles receiving immediate compensation for their lost property, while peasants gained personal freedom but remained economically dependent on their former master's land. The preservation of the peasant commune as the basic unit of rural administration represented Alexander's attempt to maintain social stability while implementing revolutionary changes in property relationships. The commune system, which had existed in various forms throughout Russian history, provided a framework for collective decision-making and mutual responsibility that the government believed would prevent the social disruption that might result from complete individualization of land ownership. The commune's authority to redistribute land periodically, collect taxes collectively, and regulate peasant movement ensured that rural society would remain organized and controllable despite the formal abolition of serfdom. The practical operation of the redemption system created numerous problems that would plague Russian agriculture for the remainder of the 19th century. Many peasants received inadequate amounts of land to support their families, particularly in regions where population density was high and agricultural productivity was low. The annual redemption payments, calculated without regard for agricultural productivity or market conditions, often consumed a disproportionate share of peasant income, leaving families with insufficient resources for improvement or investment. The system's inflexibility prevented adaptation to changing economic conditions, while the commune's collective responsibility for payments created incentives for conservative agricultural practices that discouraged innovation. The judicial reforms of 1864 represented Alexander's most successful attempt to modernize Russian institutions according to European standards, while maintaining imperial authority over the legal system. The emperor's decision to establish independent courts with professional judges reflected his understanding that economic development and social stability required predictable legal procedures that would protect property rights and ensure fair treatment of disputes. The introduction of trial by jury for criminal cases marked a revolutionary departure from traditional Russian legal practices, which had relied on administrative decisions by government officials rather than independent judicial determination of guilt or innocence. The principle of equality before the law, enshrined in the new judicial system, challenged fundamental assumptions about social hierarchy that had characterized Russian society for centuries. The reform eliminated the separate legal systems that had previously applied to different social estates, creating uniform procedures that theoretically treated nobles, merchants, and peasants according to the same legal standards. This change required extensive retraining of legal personnel and the establishment of new institutions, including bar associations and law schools, that would provide the professional expertise necessary for effective judicial administration. The creation of justices of the peace for minor civil and criminal cases brought legal services closer to ordinary citizens, while reducing the burden on higher courts that had previously handled all judicial matters. These local officials, elected by district assemblies and required to possess legal education or experience, provided accessible dispute resolution for the majority of legal conflicts that affected daily life. The system's effectiveness depended on finding qualified individuals willing to serve in often remote locations for modest compensation, but its establishment marked a significant improvement in the availability of legal services throughout the empire. The military reforms implemented by War Minister Dmitry Milyutin addressed the fundamental weaknesses that the Crimean War had exposed in Russian military organization and training. The introduction of universal military service in 1874 eliminated the previous system of recruitment that had fallen disproportionately on the peasantry, while exempting nobles and other privileged groups from military obligations. The new system required all male citizens to serve 6 years in active military service, followed by 9 years in the reserves, creating a trained population that could be mobilized quickly in case of war, while distributing military burdens more equitably across social classes. The modernization of the officer corps involved the establishment of military academies that provided professional education in tactics, strategy, and military engineering according to European standards. These institutions, including the General Staff Academy and specialized schools for artillery and engineering officers, created a professional military leadership that understood modern warfare techniques and could adapt to rapidly changing military technology. The promotion system was reformed to emphasize merit and professional competence rather than social connections or court favor, encouraging career officers to develop the skills necessary for effective military leadership. The reorganization of military administration eliminated many of the inefficiencies that had plagued Russian logistics during the Crimean War, establishing systematic procedures for supply, transportation, and communication that could support military operations across the empire's vast territories. The creation of military districts with standardized organization and equipment facilitated coordination between different regions, while ensuring that local commanders possessed the resources necessary for effective defense. The reform of military medicine, including the establishment of field hospitals and training programs for medical personnel, addressed one of the most glaring deficiencies revealed during the Crimean conflict. The introduction of modern weapons and equipment required substantial investment in military technology and manufacturing capabilities that would support Russian armed forces without dependence on foreign suppliers. The development of domestic arms production, including the establishment of new factories and the modernization of existing facilities, created industrial capabilities that would serve both military and civilian needs. The adoption of rifled muskets, improved artillery, and modern communication systems brought Russian military technology closer to European standards while providing the foundation for further technological advancement. The rise of revolutionary movements during Alexander's reign reflected the unintended consequences of his reform program, which had raised expectations for political change while maintaining autocratic restrictions on popular participation in government. The abolition of serfdom and the establishment of independent courts had demonstrated that fundamental social institutions could be transformed through imperial decision, leading many Russians to believe that political reforms were both possible and necessary. The emperor's reluctance to extend constitutional limitations on autocratic power, despite his willingness to reform other aspects of Russian society, created frustration among educated Russians who had hoped that social modernization would lead to political liberalization. The populist movement, known as Narodnichestvo, emerged among university students and young intellectuals who believed that Russia's salvation lay in connecting with the peasant masses and building a socialist society based on traditional communal institutions. The movement's adherents, influenced by the writings of Alexander Herzen and Nikolai Chernyshevsky, rejected both European capitalism and Russian autocracy as inappropriate for Russian conditions, advocating instead for a uniquely Russian form of socialism that would build upon peasant communes and cooperative traditions. The populists' romantic idealization of peasant life and their belief in the revolutionary potential of the rural masses reflected their alienation from official Russian culture and their search for authentic national identity. The Going to the People movement of the 1870s represented the populists' attempt to translate their theoretical beliefs into practical revolutionary action by living among peasants and organizing them for social transformation. Thousands of young Russians, many from privileged backgrounds, abandoned their studies and careers to work as teachers, doctors, and agricultural specialists in rural villages, hoping to educate peasants about their revolutionary potential while learning from their traditional wisdom. The movement's failure to generate significant peasant support revealed the gap between intellectual theories about rural life and the actual concerns of peasant communities, which were more interested in immediate practical improvements than abstract political ideologies. The government's response to populist activities involved extensive use of the Third Section and other security agencies to monitor, arrest, and prosecute individuals suspected of revolutionary sympathies. The trial of the 193 in 1877 to 1878 brought together populist activists from across the empire in a massive legal proceeding that exposed the movement's organization and activities while providing a platform for revolutionary propaganda. The defendants' speeches, widely reported in the press despite censorship restrictions, articulated critiques of Russian society and government that influenced public opinion and inspired further revolutionary activity. The People's Will organization, formed in 1879 from the remnants of earlier populist groups, represented a shift toward more systematic and violent revolutionary tactics that would culminate in the assassination of Alexander II. The group's members, led by figures like Andrei Zhelyabov and Sofia Perovskaya, abandoned the earlier populist emphasis on peasant revolution in favor of direct action against government officials and institutions. Their strategy of systematic terrorism, including bombings and assassinations, reflected their belief that dramatic acts of violence would inspire popular uprising while demonstrating the government's vulnerability to determined opponents. The organization's structure reflected sophisticated understanding of conspiratorial methods and security procedures that enabled it to operate effectively despite intensive government surveillance. The use of false identities, safe houses, and coded communications allowed People's Will members to coordinate their activities while avoiding detection by the Third Section. The group's ability to recruit members from different social backgrounds, including former military officers, university students, and government employees, demonstrated the breadth of opposition to autocratic rule that had developed during Alexander's reign. The assassination attempts against Alexander II revealed both the technical capabilities of the revolutionary organization and the emperor's growing isolation from Russian society. The bombing of the imperial dining room in the Winter Palace in February 1880, carried out by Stepan Kalterin, demonstrated the revolutionaries' ability to infiltrate the most secure government facilities while highlighting the emperor's vulnerability despite extensive security measures. The attack's failure to kill Alexander, due to his delayed arrival at dinner, provided only temporary reprieve from the systematic campaign that the People's Will had organized against imperial authority. The emperor's response to the assassination attempts involved both increased security measures and tentative steps toward political reform that reflected his recognition that repression alone could not eliminate revolutionary opposition. The appointment of Mikhail Loris-Melikov as head of a special commission to combat revolutionary activity represented an attempt to combine effective security measures with limited political concessions that might satisfy moderate opposition while isolating extremist groups. Loris-Melikov's proposals for expanded participation in government decision-making, including the involvement of elected representatives in legislative discussions, suggested that Alexander had begun to consider constitutional limitations on autocratic power. The final assassination attempt on March 13, 1881, succeeded through careful planning and coordination that overcame the extensive security measures protecting the emperor during his weekly review of military units. The People's Will had positioned multiple bomb throwers along the route that Alexander's carriage would follow, ensuring that alternative attackers would be available if the first attempt failed. Ignatiy Grinovitsky's successful bombing of the imperial carriage, which killed both the emperor and the assassin, marked the culmination of the revolutionary campaign, while demonstrating the ultimate futility of terrorist tactics that could eliminate individual rulers but could not transform the political system they represented. The emperor's death scene, with Alexander lying mortally wounded in the snow while his blood stained the cobblestones of the Catherine Canal, provided a dramatic conclusion to a reign that had transformed Russian society while failing to resolve the fundamental tensions between autocratic rule and popular aspirations for political participation. The irony that Alexander had been killed while returning from signing constitutional reforms that might have satisfied moderate opposition reflected the tragic timing that had characterized his entire reform program. His final words, reportedly asking to be taken to the palace to die, symbolized his commitment to imperial dignity, even in the face of revolutionary violence that had made his reform efforts appear inadequate to the challenges facing Russian society. Alexander III's accession to the throne, following his father's assassination, represented not merely a change in leadership, but a fundamental shift in the direction of Russian imperial policy that would define the empire's trajectory for the remainder of the 19th century. The new emperor, at 36 years of age, possessed a physical presence that starkly contrasted with his predecessors. His massive frame, standing 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighing over 250 pounds, conveyed an impression of immovable strength that reflected his political philosophy. His thick beard, penetrating dark eyes and heavy features created an intimidating appearance that courtiers and foreign diplomats found unsettling, while his preference for simple military uniforms over elaborate court dress demonstrated his rejection of the refined European culture that had influenced previous reigns. The traumatic circumstances of Alexander III's succession profoundly influenced his approach to governance and his understanding of the threats facing imperial authority. The emperor had witnessed his father's mangled body in the Winter Palace, had seen the blood-soaked snow where the People's Will bomber exploded, and had experienced firsthand the vulnerability of autocratic rule to revolutionary violence. These experiences convinced him that his father's liberal reforms had weakened rather than strengthened imperial authority by encouraging expectations of further political change that could never be satisfied without destroying the autocratic principle itself. The new emperor's first proclamation, issued within hours of his father's death, announced his intention to maintain faith in the strength and truth of autocratic power, while rejecting any limitations on imperial authority that might have been contemplated during the previous reign. The reversal of Alexander II's tentative steps toward constitutional government began immediately with the dismissal of Mikhail Loris-Melikov and the abandonment of his proposed reforms that would have allowed elected representatives to participate in legislative discussions. Alexander III's rejection of these proposals reflected his conviction that any sharing of power with representative bodies would inevitably lead to demands for further concessions that would ultimately destroy autocratic rule. The emperor's decision to appoint Konstantin Pobedonostsev as his chief advisor demonstrated his commitment to a fundamentally different approach to governance based on the strengthening rather than limitation of imperial authority. Pobedonosttsev's influence over Alexander III extended far beyond his formal position as procurator of the Holy Synod, encompassing virtually every aspect of domestic policy and serving as the intellectual architect of the counter-reform program that would characterize the reign. The former law professor possessed a brilliant legal mind and extensive knowledge of European political theory, but his experiences as tutor to the imperial family had convinced him that constitutional government was fundamentally incompatible with Russian conditions and national character. His voluminous correspondence with the emperor revealed a systematic critique of liberal institutions and democratic processes that provided theoretical justification for the authoritarian policies that would follow. The counter-reform program implemented during Alexander III's reign involved the systematic reversal of many judicial, educational, and administrative changes that had been introduced during the previous decades. The law of August 14, 1881, established the system of exceptional measures that allowed provincial governors to declare states of emergency, suspend normal legal procedures, and impose administrative punishments without judicial review. This legislation effectively eliminated the independence of the court system in cases involving political crimes, returning to the administrative justice that had characterized Russian governance before the judicial reforms of 1864. The measure's broad application meant that large portions of the empire operated under emergency law for extended periods, creating an atmosphere of arbitrary rule that discouraged political opposition while undermining the rule of law. The restriction of jury trials represented one of the most significant reversals of Alexander II's judicial reforms, eliminating the participation of ordinary citizens in the administration of justice for a wide range of criminal cases. The government's justification for this change emphasized the alleged incompetence of peasant jurors and their susceptibility to emotional appeals that prevented proper application of legal principles. However, the reform's actual purpose involved ensuring that political cases would be decided by government-appointed judges rather than independent juries that might prove sympathetic to revolutionary defendants. The restriction of jury trials to minor civil cases effectively eliminated popular participation in the judicial system, while returning control over criminal justice to administrative officials. The strengthening of the Zemstvo system's supervision by government-appointed officials represented another significant retreat from the local self-government that had been established during the Reform era. The appointment of land captains in 1889, drawn exclusively from the hereditary nobility and granted extensive administrative and judicial powers over peasant communities, effectively eliminated peasant participation in local governance while restoring aristocratic control over rural administration. These officials possessed the authority to overturn Zemstvo decisions, impose fines and imprisonment on peasants, and intervene in virtually every aspect of village life, creating a system of paternalistic control that treated the rural population as permanently requiring supervision and guidance. The educational counter-reforms implemented during Alexander III's reign reflected the government's determination to eliminate the sources of revolutionary ideology, while ensuring that education served to strengthen rather than question existing social and political arrangements. The University Statute of 1884 eliminated university autonomy and placed higher education under direct government control, with rectors and professors appointed by the Ministry of Education rather than elected by academic communities. The curriculum was revised to emphasize classical languages and literature, while reducing instruction in natural sciences and contemporary European thought that might encourage critical thinking about social and political issues. The introduction of higher tuition fees and stricter admission requirements effectively limited university education to the wealthy while excluding students from lower social classes who had provided much of the revolutionary movement's membership. The famous circular of 1887, known as the Cook's Children Decree, explicitly prohibited the admission to secondary schools of children from families engaged in domestic service, small trade, or other occupations deemed inappropriate for advanced education. This measure reflected the government's belief that social mobility through education had contributed to revolutionary unrest by creating a class of educated individuals who lacked appropriate employment opportunities and therefore turned to political opposition. The restriction of educational opportunities to children of established social classes was intended to maintain social stability while ensuring that education reinforced rather than challenged existing hierarchies. The implementation of Russification policies throughout the empire represented Alexander III's most systematic attempt to create cultural and linguistic uniformity that would strengthen imperial control while eliminating alternative sources of identity and loyalty. The emperor's conviction that ethnic diversity weakened imperial unity led to comprehensive programs designed to suppress minority languages, religions, and cultural institutions, while promoting Russian language, Orthodox Christianity, and imperial patriotism. These policies affected millions of non-Russian subjects and created tensions that would persist throughout the remainder of the imperial period. The Russification of Poland involved the systematic elimination of Polish cultural and educational institutions that had survived the suppression of the 1863 rebellion. The University of Warsaw, which had been allowed to reopen after the revolt's suppression, was closed permanently and replaced by a Russian institution that conducted all instruction in Russian language. Polish secondary schools were placed under Russian administration, with Polish teachers replaced by Russian educators, who who were required to conduct classes in Russian and emphasize Russian rather than Polish history and literature. The use of Polish language in official proceedings was prohibited, while Polish names of cities, streets, and institutions were replaced with Russian equivalents that eliminated visible symbols of Polish identity. The Catholic Church in Poland faced particularly severe restrictions designed to reduce its influence over Polish society while promoting Orthodox Christianity as the preferred religion of the empire. Catholic monasteries were closed or placed under strict government supervision, while the appointment of bishops required government approval and was often delayed or denied to prevent effective church leadership. The construction of new Catholic churches was prohibited in many regions, while existing churches were required to conduct services according to government-approved liturgies that eliminated references to Polish national identity or political independence. The conversion of Poles to Orthodox Christianity was actively encouraged through financial incentives and preferential treatment in government employment. The Baltic provinces of Estonia, Livonia, and Kurland experienced comprehensive Russification programs that eliminated the German cultural and administrative dominance that had characterized these regions since the medieval period. The German language schools that had provided education for both German and Estonian populations were required to conduct instruction in Russian, while German teachers were replaced by Russian educators who often lacked knowledge of local conditions and languages. The legal system, which had operated according to German law codes, was replaced by Russian legal procedures and institutions that eliminated the special privileges that German landowners had enjoyed for centuries. The University of Dorpat, a prestigious German language institution that had attracted students from throughout the Baltic region and Central Europe, was transformed into a Russian university with instruction conducted entirely in Russian and a curriculum that emphasized Russian rather than German academic traditions. The change required the dismissal of most German professors and their replacement with Russian academics who often lacked the specialized knowledge and international connections that had made Dorpat a center of scholarly excellence. The university's library, which contained extensive German and Latin collections, was supplemented with Russian works, while German publications were restricted or removed entirely. The Russification of Finland represented a particularly sensitive challenge given the Grand Duchy's constitutional status and the loyalty that Finnish subjects had demonstrated throughout the 19th century. The emperor's decision to integrate Finland more closely into the imperial system reflected his belief that special constitutional arrangements weakened imperial unity and created precedents for autonomy that might be demanded by other regions. The appointment of Russian officials to positions previously held by Finns marked the beginning of a systematic campaign to eliminate Finnish self-government while promoting Russian language and culture throughout the Grand Duchy. The Finnish postal system, which had operated independently since the early 19th century, was integrated into the imperial postal service, eliminating one of the visible symbols of Finnish autonomy while ensuring that all correspondence would be subject to Russian censorship and surveillance. The Finnish military units, which had maintained separate organization and traditions, were disbanded and replaced by Russian regiments that would serve throughout the empire rather than defending specifically Finnish interests. The use of Finnish language in official proceedings was restricted, while Russian was made mandatory for government positions and legal proceedings. The industrial development that accelerated during Alexander III's reign represented one of the